Angela, you are a clairvoyant undertaker in wild Berlin. You have a Mexican background, where people are not at all tied down to materialism. That's why I dare to ask you the question that I am often asked. What about the deceased who remain stuck on Earth? Are there really ghosts? Are there even poltergeists? Are there spooks? Is there such a thing as occupation by deceased people?
Yes,
Widefield, what can you say about that?
this actually exists. 60% of those who die do not know that they have died. And that's why it's so important. And I would say, as first aid, how do you say, as an emergency, pastoral care for someone who has died, to tell them first that you have died? There is a woman, Iris Paxino, can I recommend? She wrote a book, The Connection Between the Living and the Deceased, or The Bridge Between the Living and the Deceased by Uwe Hausverlag. She wasn't clairvoyant until she turned 18. Then her beloved grandmother died. And then she started asking, Grandma, where are you? Are you to my right or to my left or something? In such a back area, that is where the deceased, the spiritual world is, so to speak, where we cannot see it that way. And she did the same with her angels, and so she could begin to sense where the angel or the grandmother was. And through this, she began to notice deceased people. And she describes, for example, one day she was driving past an accident, and she could see that someone had died, but she couldn't stop there and then get out of it straight away at the next exit. And then he realized that someone was actually with these people and said the Lord's Prayer for the deceased. And that alone helped the deceased a lot to orient themselves. So we can so simple. It's just an attention. We have to be so attentive in the moment that we think, okay, that's the deceased. What do I have to do now so that I can help him get the hang of going into the light? Yes, and she also describes in this book, because there are so many of these deceased people hanging around and don't know where they are going, that they often occupy weak people. And I read this book and only then experienced this in my own family, and thank God I had read that because then I was able to fully understand everything that was going on. We had a friend who was very MS, so she had MS and an eating disorder, and she absolutely didn't want to have any life-prolonging measures. And on the day the doctor told her there was no other way, she died that night. And then she cast a woman who was very supportive of her, and who received shocking news on the same day. And these occupations by the deceased lead to mental illness. Most mental illnesses are caused by deceased people. And this woman, this Iris Paxino, is a psychologist, so she has something to do with it. So this woman, who was then cast by her, had already developed psychosis, or had had it 15 years before. And that was the case with the first psychosis of two deceased people who simply hung on to themselves because they didn't know where they were going. And now it was cast by this friend. And through another friend of mine, who is also clairvoyant, we managed to get her to let it. Then she tried it on me.
Then she bites on granite.
Yes, because of that. So I was like a meter above the ground. I couldn't really get into my body. I was really desperate. I didn't know how to get down to the handle. That wasn't nice, not nice. And then I spoke to Thomas Meyer, who offers anthroposophical meditation training, which I can highly recommend, but who also deals with the deceased. I then called him and said, "Help, I can't get down here." And then he said, "Yes, you still have an opening to her. You're still taking care of the estate, aren't you?" I said, "Yes."
Yes.
And then I said, "Yes." Then he said, "Yes, then you have to do this. You have to close this opening." And that's what I did. He's like, "It's over now. I'm doing it now. I no longer have an opening to you." And then suddenly an incredible amount of air came out of me. So I thought it was like a balloon that let out a lot of air. My colleague was sitting next to me, and his eyes were so big because it was unbelievable. And then I had peace. But then she tried it on someone else, on a child, who also had facial twitches and suddenly got a lot of facial twitches. And then I told my mother what was going on. And she said, "Please tell her to leave him alone, to move away from him." That's what she did. And that also made her better. And the problem was that this woman simply experienced something bad in her childhood. And she didn't process that. And if you don't process these things in life, then you have to after death. And that was this bow again. She experienced this when she was young, and then she was, at this point again, MS, and also couldn't accept the MS. So she always said, "Yes, I'm better. I'm going to get better." And you could see how things were getting worse and worse. She just couldn't accept that. And that was this inability to process what was done to her, something she couldn't process when she was young, not even when she was sick. And she only had to do that afterwards. So it helps if you deal with things, especially the thought that you chose this yourself in life, in order to learn from it. Because only where there is pain can there be further development.
Who are you telling? I had me then. So nobody warns you in culture. So even as a Protestant theologian until my near-death experience in 2002, I pursued theology in a very materialistic way. Otherwise, I wouldn't have gotten to this career position. Then you are sorted out in a timely manner and are considered a weirdo. So over time, as I became more involved in meditation and self-knowledge, it became clear to me. My grandmother died when I was 14 years old. As I said, I wasn't allowed to see them either. The topic concerned me, death in general, otherwise only of pets, and I was transformed afterwards. I had very severe mental stress. I was suicidal. My grandma was too before. I was bored a lot at school anyway, so I was rather under-challenged. I started now. The school death at the time, it was in Sütterlin-Schrift at the back, i.e., the old German handwriting. I started teaching myself now. Grandma's Singer sewing machine was still in my room. She was a seamstress and used it to make a lot of things for us, including sewing a lot of children's things for me herself, so that I always looked like I had slept in a dream. Now I sat down at this sewing machine and learned how to use it, how to thread the top thread, the bottom thread, and the like, and I was getting worse and worse. So that accompanied me for well over 10 years. And 5 years ago I met someone who was very close, who glorified his late father very much, and because I just look very closely now. So that's this open space. I have no preconceptions, no pattern in the encounter, I says. Say, have you noticed that the shape of your face is changing? You actually have a very wide nose, and suddenly you get a very narrow nose. You have full lips, like a singer, and now your lips are as thin as a general's. And even your eye color is changing. Have you noticed that?
So it can definitely help those who have died if you read their letters to them. But, as I said, mourning must only last for a certain period of time. So I grieve between 4 and 6 in the afternoon because I have to close it again. Because otherwise I always have this door open and then I'm neither here nor there and you go crazy. And I believe that these occupations often happen in hospitals, for example, where people are in a state of shock and then deceased. People also hang around. This is not easy to experience. Well, I've also experienced this where a friend for example, couldn't die, and then I worked on him with my girlfriend, or tried to look at it in a helpful supernatural way. Then it turns out he had a girlfriend who had died earlier, and she had also clung to him and didn't want to let him go. Then you first had to tell this woman that she had died and that she didn't belong here at all. She simply has to go into the spiritual world, first she back, and then he could die. But he just couldn't leave his body because this woman couldn't let him go. And I've experienced this twice with dying people, that they couldn't and couldn't die. And then we looked at it psychically with my friend, who is clairvoyant, and saw that they were occupied by someone else, so they couldn't let go of him. You have to, or there can also be black magic occupations. That exists too. So that is, of course, a field in itself, but it is a sensitive topic. And this book by Iris Paxino can really help you understand how it works and what you can do. For example, she also had an encounter with a deceased person and he said, "I didn't die." And yet I said, "You died." "No, I didn't die." Then she says, "We'll meet in the next room." And of course she has to get out of the room and back into the other one. And he just went through the wall. And then she says, "Look, you came through the wall." "No, I didn't die." "Okay," she says. "Then we'll have a glass of water together." And then he couldn't grab the glass. Then he finally got it. Sometimes you have to make it pretty hard to make it clear that this is really the case. And that's why it's very helpful if you deal with it beforehand. Because it's just like going on a trip to JWD, someplace you've never been before, at the end of the world. And what are you doing? You pack your suitcase, and then you also buy travel guides and deal with them. And when you get there, you'll know because you've dealt with it. But if you don't, then you have a problem, because you don't know what your language is, what a culture is where you are. And then you hang on to the nearest person in the airport and say, "Can you please tell me where I am and what's going on? I have no idea where I am."
Yes, that's just the old tradition. Otherwise, Tibetan Book of the Dead and the like, those were always the travel guides. Because a lot of people will ask questions now. Can you say that very slowly? Iris Paxino?
Yes, Paxino, P-A-X-I, Paxino.
Yes, and then pressure's over.
I think that's called pressure between the living and the dead. That's in Urok House. By the way, she has also just written a very nice book about angels. And before that, he also wrote a book about pain. Yes, that is highly recommended. So it's very pragmatic, practical, and with a call or request to set off and experience it for yourself. That's always the best because everything else is just theory. If you only take all these spiritual things purely theoretically, then you arrive there and don't know anything because you have only seen or experienced it intellectually. Or you have seen it but you don't live through it. It wasn't meditated on. I can only perceive what I meditate and experience there. But what is intellectual doesn't help me because it is not what I experience in the spiritual world.
Otherwise, I also put the brain with the intellect.
Exactly, that's how it is. And then you have exactly the same problem. There are also experienced people, spiritual people, who are disoriented in the spiritual world because that is just a theory. And that doesn't help me. And that's why, for me, meditation is definitely the best thing to do, because that's also the area, and that's what I also do in grief counseling, in the grief group, that we only then meditate a bit, because that's exactly where you meet the deceased. This is the level where you can talk to the deceased. And Rudolf Steiner, for example, also said that anthroposophy can be read to the deceased. This is a language that is difficult for us to understand because we have to think. But this is a language that the dead and angels can understand. The other book I would highly recommend is by Sigvart zu Olenberg, Bridge Over the River. These are messages from the afterlife. And he gives some great information. He died in 1915 at the age of 32 from his wounds in the First World War. And by the way, he didn't understand that he was dead until the funeral. So you have your body from the front to Liedenberg Castle, which I can highly recommend. It's an hour north of Berlin. It's very, very beautiful there. And that's where he was buried, and that's where he understood that it was only at the ceremony that it was about him that he had died. And he was able to make contact with his sisters, with whom he was very close, without being in a dream. And has given messages from the spiritual world for over 30 years. And you can really learn a lot about how the deceased are doing. So grief is the worst thing there is for the deceased. He keeps saying, "Please let it be sadness, it's such a pain for me too. You better think about where I am now, and that is our connection." And he also gave them a lot of meditations, very beautiful meditations and poems. And through this collaboration, he is mentally much, much faster and has been able to develop much more quickly. He was also a person who didn't just enjoy everything, but always wanted to go further, also in the spiritual world. And he did it very quickly. He was at Devachan in a year, when normally it takes us a lot longer to get there, because he was so striving for the spiritual. And there, yes, even up to the Second World War, he gives some great information that you can now use during this time. And that's very important. Staying positive, staying connected, meditating. This is where you can really recover your strength, and no one can take it away from you. That's what you ultimately live in the spiritual world, the meditation world. What you can experience in meditation is the what, the substance. That's why I say to go back to the beginning now. Every person is religious, and when you are in the spiritual world, religion is like the air that we breathe here now. It's just there. The spiritual, the heavenly, is simply there. That's what we live there. That's what we're basically made of. And that's why if you deal with it and then go home again, you can live with it or experience it completely differently than if you hadn't dealt with it at all and only dealt with the physical. Most people are afraid because they only deal with the physical and the material, and that they can't take a picture of what happens afterwards. And that's why fear is still very much in play today. And that's a pretty good way to control people or get them under control.
They find everything pointless, painful, are weakened, hide away, and become infantile believers in experts.
Exactly, that's why I think you have to learn to trust. So there is also a very nice result prayer or mood of devotion from Steiner. Maybe I should say that again at the end.
First of all, I would like to read the title of the book Bridge Over the River, the author, because For some people, it happens too quickly. What is the author's name?
This is about the stream of messages from the afterlife of Sigvard zu Eulenburg.
To Eulenburg.
Yes, thanks. And he also gave them a lot of meditations. Very nice, exactly. Yes, and this prayer of devotion, I keep telling myself that. So share it when I notice that fear is coming. Because fear is also an entity. And when these shadows come over us, we have to actively and mentally counteract them so that they disappear again. And this prayer of devotion goes like this. No matter what happens in the next few weeks, in the next few hours, I can't change it through fear. I expect it through the most perfect inner peace of mind, through the most perfect calmness of the mind. Our development is hindered by fear and fruit. Through the waves of fear and fruit, we reject the impulses that want to enter our soul from the future. The surrender to the spiritual wisdom in the events, the certainty that what is to come must be true, and that it will be right in some direction. Bringing this up in thoughts and ideas is the mood of devotional prayer. Part of what we have to learn is to live out of pure trust, without any security of existence, out of trust in the ever-present help of the spiritual world. Truly, without this trust our courage sinks. Let us properly discipline our will and seek inner awakening every morning and every evening. Trust is simply the be-all and end-all in the relationship. We can actually only do that if we want to connect. The victory trip to Eulenburg 1944 also says that no matter how bad the situation is, you just have to stay tied up and ideally pray every hour. Because if you only meditate in the morning and evening, the waves of dark nights come over you. But if you do that every hour, then those nights won't get to you anymore. There's such a nice app with a gong that chimes every hour to remind you, time to pray. And really, it makes a huge difference. So I implemented it, and I have to say it's very helpful because you're constantly reminded that you're tied up. And don't constantly forget that because of external activities. And then only do it in the morning and evening, but really every hour. At some point you get so into it that you get a feeling for it. But that's when those dark nights can no longer be reached, because you then constantly have this connection. So as a little note at the end.
Thank you very much. Does your dear heavenly assistant want something else?
There are certainly many topics that still need to be explored in greater depth.
This will be the second round.
I would often think that way, so now I have a few secondary thoughts or a few more branches. So cafe death, for example, was a topic that we hadn't even addressed yet.
We already had that in the first series.
Oh, well, you already have a series, then it's good.
I know it's a blast. I jumped on it straight away.
Yes, otherwise, I think this topic with ghosts will be much, much more complex.
Then I'll destroy the people on YouTube. That's a lot otherwise. They're more likely to get scared. So that's the big deal here.
That should be a separate topic, I think.
Yes, but that is also something where you have to bring in specialists. Well, that's easy, I think, if you know that people can be disoriented if they don't. During the grief counseling training, there was a police officer there, a criminal police officer, who actually, the criminal police officers, come to the most terrible places where someone has been killed or something like that, and he was always the first to tell the deceased, "You died. Now go into the light." And that's just the two things. Those 3 words, "you died," can be such a tremendous help that you don't really have to do anything else, just send the Lord's Prayer afterwards. And with what Iris has experienced, you can provide incredible help. This means they can set off and go their own way. You don't have to constantly and forever and no idea, but yes, this and that. Also ask the angel to take over. Ask that they take over. Ask the spiritual world to take the lead. Ask it or the other deceased people that they can help with that too. And then let go. Complete that. So that's always the case as a matter of demarcation. Yes, that is very helpful.